There is an object sitting in Westminster Abbey that most people have never thought twice about. It is made of wood, not reinforced wood, not treated or specially preserved wood, just ordinary timber, shaped and assembled by a craftsman sometime in the late 13th century. And yet, this simple wooden object survived wars that destroyed cities, fires that consumed palaces, political revolutions that erased entire systems of power, and more than 7 centuries of continuous human history. That fact alone is worth pausing on, because when you look at what this object was connected to, the ceremonies it anchored, the authority it represented, the institutions that protected it, the word ordinary starts to feel less accurate. This raises a question that doesn't have a clean answer. Why wood? The civilizations that surrounded this object built in stone. They cast their symbols in bronze and gold. They used materials specifically chosen to last, to impress, to resist time. Wood rots, wood burns, wood warps and weakens under the right conditions. And yet, for something considered essential to one of the longest-running institutions in recorded history, wood was the material selected. Some historians point to symbolic reasons. Others suggest it was simply practical, but neither explanation fully accounts for the level of importance this object was given, or why that importance never seemed to fade, even as everything around it changed. But this is where it becomes unclear. The survival of this object is not just a matter of luck or careful storage. It was damaged, moved, borrowed, and at certain points in history, treated with a kind of disregard that would have ended the story of most artifacts. And yet it persisted. What is harder to explain is not the physical survival. Wood can survive under the right conditions, but the consistency of the reverence surrounding it. Across different rulers, different political systems, and different centuries, the attitude toward this object remained remarkably stable. That kind of consistency usually points to something deeper than habit. When researchers begin looking more carefully at the records of who controlled this object, at the conditions placed around its use, and at the reactions that occurred whenever its significance was questioned, the picture does not become clearer. It becomes more complicated. The straightforward explanation exists. It is documented and widely accepted, but straightforward explanations and complete explanations are not always the same thing. There are details in this history that sit slightly outside what the standard account covers, and those details are exactly where this investigation begins. The accepted explanation for this object is clear and well documented. Around 1296, King Edward I of England ordered a wooden chair to be built. The purpose was specific. Edward had recently seized a large sandstone block from Scotland, a stone known as the Stone of Destiny, and he wanted it permanently housed beneath a throne used for royal coronations. The chair was constructed around that stone, and from that point forward, it became the seat upon which English monarchs were crowned. The historical record on this is consistent. Scholars agree on the basic facts. Edward built the chair as a statement of political dominance. By sitting above the Scottish stone during coronation, each new monarch was, in a sense, sitting above Scotland itself. As political messages go, it was direct and deliberate. At first, this explanation seems complete. But there is a problem. Political symbols, by their nature, are tied to political circumstances. When those circumstances change, the symbols usually change with them. Flags get redesigned, monuments get removed, objects that represented one era's power get quietly replaced by the next era's preferred imagery. That is how political symbolism has worked across most of recorded history. And yet this chair followed none of that pattern. The relationship between England and Scotland shifted dramatically across the following centuries. The politics changed. The monarchy changed hands more than once. The entire structure of British governance was rewritten at various points. Through all of it, the chair remained not just present, but considered essential. This raises questions that the political explanation doesn't fully answer. Why were coronations considered incomplete with this specific chair? There were other thrones, there were other ceremonial objects of equal or greater visual importance, but the records consistently show that this wooden seat held a category of its own. It was not simply used, it was treated with the kind of careful reverence that institutions typically reserve for objects they consider sacred rather than symbolic. That distinction matters. Sacred objects are protected because people believe something would be lost without them. Political symbols are protected only as long as the politics support them. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. The gap between what the chair was officially built to represent and how it was actually treated across 7 centuries is not a small one. Some historians acknowledge this gap but consider it a natural result of long tradition. Others believe the tradition itself points to something that existed before Edward's political motivations, something the official explanation doesn't fully cover. That question remains open. When researchers examine the historical records surrounding the coronation chair, most expect to find straightforward documentation: construction details, ceremonial usage logs, maintenance records, and those things exist. But alongside them, there are other details, quieter details, details that are not dramatic on their own, but become harder to ignore when you look at them together. The first is a matter of location and custody. From the time it was built, the chair was placed inside Westminster Abbey and kept under the direct care of religious authorities, not the royal household, not a government institution, the church. That arrangement persisted for centuries, and it raises a question that the standard explanation doesn't fully address. Churches are not storage facilities for political objects. They are custodians of things considered spiritually significant. The decision to place this chair, officially described as a symbol of military conquest, inside a religious institution and under religious care is not a small detail. It points to a classification that goes beyond politics. But this is where it becomes unclear. The records also contain references to specific rules surrounding the chair's accessibility. These were not casual arrangements. There are accounts describing restrictions on who was permitted to approach it, conditions under which it could be viewed, and a general atmosphere of controlled access that went well beyond what any decorative or ceremonial object would typically require. Some of these accounts are inconsistent with each other, and historians debate how literally they should be interpreted, but the recurring nature of those references across different periods and different sources is worth noting. Excessive restriction usually signals that something is being protected, not just preserved. And this introduces a separate layer of doubt, connected to the stone beneath the chair rather than the chair itself. The Stone of Destiny has its own contested history. The official record places its seizure in 1296, but various sources, some credible, some difficult to verify, trace the stone's significance back much further. Some accounts connect it to early medieval Scotland, others push the origin claims into periods that predate reliable documentation entirely. Researchers disagree on how seriously to take those older accounts, but if any portion of them is accurate, it changes the context of the chair considerably. This is where the standard explanation starts to show strain. If the chair held authority purely because Edward I declared it so, the restrictions, the religious custody, and the deep history of the stone beneath it would all be unnecessary. Declared political power follows the person who declares it. It does not typically attach itself to an object and remain there for 7 centuries. That pattern doesn't fully make sense within what the official record provides. When you follow the history of the coronation chair across 7 centuries, a pattern begins to emerge. Not a pattern of careful preservation or ceremonial routine. Those things exist and are well documented. The pattern worth examining is different. It appears in the moments when the chair's official purpose should have made it irrelevant, and yet somehow it remained relevant. These are not obscure moments buried in footnotes. They are recorded historical events, separated by centuries, involving very different people with very different motivations. And each one adds a layer of difficulty to the standard explanation. The clearest example comes from 1657. Oliver Cromwell had done something almost without precedent in English history. He had abolished the monarchy entirely. The king had been executed. The institution of royal power had been formally dismantled. Cromwell governed as Lord Protector, a title deliberately chosen to distance itself from kingship. And yet, when the time came for his investiture ceremony, the formal confirmation of his authority, the coronation chair was brought out and used. This raises questions that are difficult to answer cleanly. If the chair was purely a symbol of royal power, using it contradicted the entire foundation of what Cromwell represented. Some historians argue he used it to borrow legitimacy, but that argument only holds if the chair carried something beyond its association with kings. Otherwise, borrowing from it would have weakened him, not strengthened him. But this is where it becomes unclear in a different direction. In 1914, a group of suffragette activists placed a small explosive device beneath the chair. The damage was minor, but the targeting was deliberate. They did not attack a throne room or a palace. They chose this specific object. That level of symbolic precision suggests the chair held meaning that extended well beyond its ceremonial function, meaning recognized even by those who opposed the institutions it represented. And then, in 1950, Scottish nationalists removed the Stone of Destiny from beneath the chair on Christmas Day and transported it back to Scotland. They left the chair itself untouched. That decision is one historians interpret differently. Some say the stone was always the true object of significance. Others point out that the chair continued to be used for coronations after the stone was gone, which complicates that reading considerably. And this is where it becomes unclear in a different direction. In 1953, the Stone of Destiny was returned, placed back beneath the chair just in time for Queen Elizabeth II's coronation. That move might suggest the restored significance of the stone, but the chair held on to its own reverence. Its repeated use involved countless deliberate choices. Each time, someone decided to use this specific object. That choice wasn't merely automated, not after a war, not after an attack itself. Each recommendation to demand and then to use added a new layer of meaning. And this is where the explanation starts to weaken most visibly. If the chair's entire significance rested on the stone beneath it, its removal should have ended the chair's ceremonial role. It did not. The reverence continued. The usage continued. Something remained attached to the object itself, and the records do not fully explain what that something was. After examining the records, the inconsistencies, and the patterns that don't align with the standard explanation, researchers are left with a question that has no clean answer. Why did this object hold the level of significance it did? Several theories exist, and it is worth looking at each one carefully, not to find a conclusion, but to understand why the question itself remains open after all this time. The first and most widely accepted theory is institutional momentum. The argument is straightforward. Once the chair was used in one coronation, it became the expected object for the next. Each use reinforced the tradition, and the tradition eventually became stronger than the original reason behind it. Under this view, the chair's significance has nothing to do with any special quality it possessed. It simply accumulated importance the way most long-standing traditions do, through repetition and the human tendency to treat familiar things as necessary things. This explanation is reasonable, but it doesn't fully account for the moments when the tradition should have broken and didn't. Cromwell's use of the chair, the targeting of it by activists, the decision to leave it behind in 1950. Institutional momentum alone doesn't explain those specific choices made by people who were actively working against the institutions the chair represented. Others take a different view entirely. Some researchers argue that the chair's significance connects to a belief system that predates Edward I, possibly predating Christianity in Britain altogether. Under this interpretation, certain objects were understood in earlier cultures to carry authority not because any individual declared it, but because the object itself was seen as a link to something much older. The chair, in this reading, was built around the stone precisely because the stone already carried that older association. The chair inherited the weight of what the stone represented. This theory is harder to verify. The sources that support it reach into periods where documentation is limited and interpretation varies widely. Some believe it, others disagree. but it remains a serious line of inquiry for a small group of historians. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult for everyone involved. None of these theories are without problems. None of them are fully confirmed by the available evidence. What the records leave behind is simply this: a wooden object that outlasted empires, remained irreplaceable to people who agreed on almost nothing else, and continues to sit in Westminster Abbey without a complete explanation for why it mattered as deeply as it did. Some questions remain open not because the evidence is missing, but because what exists still doesn't fully add up.